Welcome everybody to the September 2017 Ember NYC. We're very grateful to be hosted here at Adipar. I think Chris will tell you a little bit about the company, and I'm sure you guys are hiring, et cetera. So I'll let him do that. And a little bit about Ember NYC for those of you who maybe if this is your first time. Ember NYC has been happening on a mostly monthly basis for about 4 or 5 years, maybe 5 years now. Been a long time going. We lately have been circulating through different offices around the city. So if you, your company would like to host an Ember NYC, you should definitely talk to me. We can make that happen. And of course, I'm always looking for speakers. So if you have an Ember topic that you'd like to present on, that would be great. We do 2 types of events at Ember NYC. We have an evening of talks like tonight, where it's kind of someone's prepared a presentation, they're going to teach you something. And then we have project nights, which are more hands-on, a little less formal, and that tends to be an opportunity to do some pair programming, get some help if you're stuck with something, maybe do a deep dive on a particular topic that somebody wants to do a workshop style kind of walkthrough on, that kind of thing. Jorge, where are you, Jorge? In the back raising his hands. Jorge is responsible for organizing the project nights. So if you have an idea of something you'd like to learn or something you'd like to help facilitate, you should talk to him, and we can make that happen. Our next meetup on the calendar is our October meetup, which I have to remember where we're hosting it, but I think we have a location. But we definitely have a speaker, who is Alex Blum, coming down from Toronto, and he's going to be giving a talk about a new library that he's been working on called Corber, which is the inheritor, the replacement, the new Ember CLI Cordova. So if you're interested in writing hybrid Ember apps, I think you'll get a lot out of his talk. Or even if you're not, I'm sure you'll learn a lot anyway. With that, I'm Luke Mealy. I forgot to introduce myself. I've been organizing all this time. I run a company called Yap here in New York that has been on Ember since the very early days. And with that, I'm happy to introduce our speaker, somebody whose code I use on a regular basis and I really appreciate the quality of which. And he's going to talk to us today about ES6 classes in Ember from Adipar, Chris Garrett.
Hey, how's it going? Like Luke said, my name is Chris Garrett, and I'm going to be talking about classes and decorators today. But first, the obligatory little bit about me. I am a UC Santa Cruz grad, Banana Slugs, a Bay Area native, and I've worked with Ember for about 5 years. I started right after Mach-D's router refactor a while back, pre 1.0 days. And you may know me as P Zurok or just Zurok, the P is silent, on GitHub, Slack, Twitter, and basically everywhere else. And I work on the ICE team here at Adipar. That's infrastructure, components, and Ember, because we like our TLAs here. As the infrastructure team at a growing company, we get lots of interesting projects, from refactors to upgrades to libraries like Ember Table and Vertical Collection that really push the boundaries of what is possible in Ember and what is possible in the browser. After an initial push to a relatively modern version of Ember, we started work on a project that I think every web developer has had to do at some point or another. That was build a component library, like Bootstrap. One of the most important things about a component library is clear, accessible, and easy to read documentation. That's definitely the thing that has made Bootstrap, Foundation, and others so successful. So we realized early on that we would not really be able to maintain a full website like that, so we started looking at documentation generators. First up was UIDoc, or YUIDoc. It's officially the unofficial standard in the Ember community. It's used for the Ember and Ember CLI API docs, but if we dive in, it's a little lacking. You basically have to state all of the information that could be pulled from the code again. We have to tell it there's a class here, that it extends another class, that it has this method is foo, what the parameters of those methods are and their types. It's really a lot of overhead and really just one step below making that whole site. At the same time, it doesn't even have support for modern ES features like modules. Everything in UEDoc has to be based on classes. So it was out. Next up was JSDoc. So similar to UEDoc, in fact, the only difference between this one and the last one is that rather than declaring that there's a method named isFoo, we declare that it is a method that belongs to the foo component class. Basically the same. It does have some more support for modern features, but its development is going very slowly. And so we wanted to find something a little bit better. So I kept Googling and I found ESDoc. Now, ESDoc was built with ES classes in mind from the very beginning. In fact, you cannot use ESDoc without them. There's no way to just annotate existing structures. I thought this was a little bit extreme at first, but I decided to give it a try, and the results were pretty amazing. So you can see here, this is the same component from before, but rewritten a little bit, and with a couple extra properties added just to demonstrate some of the possibilities with the SDoc, what it can do. The annotations, basically almost non-existent, just that parameter there, block comments, and that's it. From that, we get a full documentation website, public and private members, even the decorators that are applied to those members. And there's even a plugin that is getting started on doing type inference on those fields and on default types for parameters for methods and such. So this is a massive tooling win. From an infrastructure perspective, this is absolutely huge. Maintaining documentation like UIDoc takes a lot of time and ultimately a lot of developer hours. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. You know, slowly sinking time into that when it could be automated. And this is when I started to see the advantages of ES classes. You might be wondering why ES classes. We have a great object model in the Ember community. We've been using it for a very long time. We use it for literally everything. It would be a massive refactor to try to move away from it. And really, what are we getting out of that? It's basically just a slightly cleaner syntax. It looks very similar. The advantages are sharing code with the entire JavaScript community. Ember has always been about convention over configuration, and this is really just another step in that. We get to share tooling and editors like ESDoc, VS Code with other frameworks, with other libraries and other developers. We get to share education. Imagine never having to explain the Ember object model to a new hire. That would be great. And we can even share code. We can pull out utility code into independent decorator libraries that can be used across any framework. Even things like maybe Computeds could one day be pulled out into a completely independent library. So once I started realizing how much potential was here, I dived deep on ES classes and figured out what needed to be done in order to get them working in Ember today. And the ES class RFC, which was recently merged and accepted, was the result of that. But you may have heard the old adage, it takes a village to write an RFC. That's especially true in the Ember community. I'd like to thank Rob Jackson and Chris Thoburn. Rob helped me immensely with the RFC process, and Chris was the one who basically let me know that it could be done in the first place. So without them, would not have happened. Anyways, enough with all of the intro. Let's dive in. So I'm going to go over three things. Usage with the RFC as it is spec'd out. Usage with it how it is currently in Ember, because there are parts that need to be changed internally. And then usage with legacy versions of Ember. Like I said, Adapar is on Ember 1.11, and we are using ES classes today, so it's totally possible. And one final note, this is still experimental. Class fields are stage 3, decorators are stage 2. They could change as they work their way through the TC39 process. So before you put any of this in production, definitely consider the risks. All right, so usage as specified in the RFC. The first thing you're going to want to do is install Ember Decorators. It adds the Babel transforms and everything to compile it correctly. It's not an official Ember library. It's just a side project at the moment, but we're hoping that it will flesh out decorators and class usage over time. So here is a simple custom input component. As you can see, just provides a tag name and a default value. Here's the same thing rewritten with the S classes. Right away, we can see it's very similar. We just have equals instead of colons, semicolons instead of commas. And we have a class name at the top there. Technically, you don't have to use that. It could be an anonymous class that you're exporting, but you probably should. If you've ever used a class that was not resolved using the Ember resolver, you'll know that that's how it applies the class name to the class. And so if you want to know what class you're dealing with at all times, just give it a class name. Now, you might want to pass in a value to that custom input component, and you would find that it would not work. It turns out that class fields actually get assigned somewhat like this. They get assigned in the constructor after the call to super, and that's where passed in values on components are getting set. So the workaround here is actually something like this, where and this is in PR right now on Ember, you would receive the props in the constructor where you could mutate them before they're passed to that super method. Another option that we realized was possible recently is you can actually just use an initializer for the class field. So it's just an expression that runs and figures out the value and then check against this dot value or this dot whatever else is on there. And we're also considering adding a decorator that would handle all of this for you. So let's dive into some of the decorators that already exist. On the left, we got the old computed syntax, and on the right, we have a shiny new computed decorator. As you can see, it uses ES getters and setters instead of functions. You can actually use functions, but we're probably going to remove that in a future version of Ember Decorators in favor of this syntax. So it's more in line with JavaScript as a whole. And you can also do things like just apply the read-only decorator to that computed in order to mark it as read-only. Although that wouldn't really make sense with the setter there. Also, all of the computed macros, except for one, exist as decorators. The one is read-only because it would conflict with the other read-only decorator. And the solution there is to just do add read-only, add alias. It's basically the same thing and reads pretty cleanly. And then we also have service injection decorators. They work basically the same as the old style. You can optionally pass in a service name, or you can just rely on reflection to get the service name from the class field. And you can also do on and observes. Note, it's observes, not observer. That was a decision that happened early on in decorators that I'm not sure exactly why, but I think this syntax is much, much cleaner and kind of demonstrates the power of decorators here. And another new action that we've added, or another new decorator that we've added is the action decorator. So this actually can just be applied to any function, turns it into an action. The only thing to note about that is that the function is on the class and on the actions hash at the same time. So if you have like a click action, it will trigger both when the action triggers and when you click on the component. You have to watch out for collisions like that. But other than that, it works perfectly. So if you want to know more about this, you can check out the API docs for Ember Decorators. They're linked on GitHub and generated with ESDoc. Another thing that the RFC touched on was extending both ways. So you should, by the time it's all worked out and all done, you should be able to extend using class syntax and then extend right back using the old .extend style. You'll be able to convert your code base one component at a time or one class at a time without having to worry about cross-compatibility issues. The final thing is there is no mix-in support for the new syntax. Class decorators are still in flux. There's been some changes in the last draft, so we're still not entirely sure what they're going to look like. Mix-ins themselves are a very generic library. Like there are already mix-in libraries like core decorators and others that could be used with Ember or with ES classes rather, with no changes. So it's not necessarily something that Ember needs to make specifically for Ember. And the spec may choose to add mix-ins or traits in the future. Seems unlikely at this point, but it's always good to leave room, especially when that would probably be the preferred approach in the future. Also, you can still use mix-ins using .extends. So if you really need them, you can just extend an anonymous component like so. All right, so to review real quick, class fields are on the instance. They are not on the prototype anymore. You need to provide defaults either in an initializer or a constructor. Merged and concatenated fields will work as expected. That might actually change a little bit. We had to talk about that. But yeah, decorators exist for computeds, injections, observers, and events and actions. Extends works both ways. You're not stuck in one style or the other. And mix-ins do not work except for .extend, through .extend. Okay, so that's how you'll use it once all of that work is done. How can you use them today with modern versions of Ember? There are several major caveats. The first one is that merged and concatenated properties will not work at all. They'll just overwrite the superclass. So things like class names, attribute bindings, class name bindings, those do not work. The second one is that observers and events do not work at all. And the third one is that .extend does not work once you start using ES classes. You cannot go back to the traditional style. Now that last one is going to require major internal changes to core objects, so it's unlikely that there will be any backwards compatible fixes. But we do have some compatibility helpers in the works for the other issues. For concatenated properties, like class name bindings, we are looking into creating something like this, a concatenated decorator. We actually have a PR out for it right now that would allow you to just specify that a property should be concatenated with its parents. And this actually has the benefit of being declarative and kind of telling you what's going on there. We're also thinking about having specialized decorators like at class name or at attribute. That way you would, because we have so few use cases of these by default, these would just kind of allow you to annotate properties and use them that way. For events and observers, we would probably add class decorators in a legacy support library. And these would just add a little bit of pre-processing to the class that would allow observers and events to work the way they should. Finally, usage with legacy Ember. Like I said, we're on 1.11, so 1.11 through 2.12, what's up with those versions? So that has the same major caveats as 2.13 plus, but the constructor doesn't work. It doesn't work because of the way that we used to do injections through the double extends. And one extra side effect of this is that class fields don't work for the exact reason that I mentioned before. They get assigned in the constructor. So the way around this is to actually use a decorator that you can get right now at the utility decorators Ember add-on. It's just a simple decorator that takes the value of the class field and applies it to the prototype immediately rather than in the constructor. So at proto, it's on the prototype. And then instead of anything you would have done in the constructor function, you can still do in a init because that still works. All right. So takeaways. ES classes make Ember easier to learn, make it easier for newcomers to understand. They allow us to share resources and tooling with a much wider community and basically share all of those wins with everyone. They bring us more in line with the future of JavaScript as a whole and unblock things like TypeScript. And I honestly just think they look better, if that's a reason at all. So yeah, any questions? The question was it Ember prop types? Had I considered using Ember prop types for our component library and whether and how it might work in this ES class world? You know, I'd have to take a look at how it works internally just to kind of figure all of that out. But it probably could be a class decorator, if I had to say, something like that. We can just annotate that these are the fields that it should be able to receive. You might also be able to have it be a field decorator. The question was, what was the RFC process like? It was interesting. I think it actually went very smoothly compared to some RFCs I've seen. Part of it was like letting go of certain things that I really wanted to like push through, like dropping observers and events was kind of an early question, like, oh, they don't work. Is that terrible? Do we really need them to work? But you know, one step at a time, and I think dropping that allowed us to get it through really quickly, which because it was uncontroversial. So I think that was interesting to see.
So I was basically just pointing out, so on the example on the right, you see how you can sort of re-express this function reset foo and apply on init to it, and observes to, I actually never seen the left. I didn't know the left side worked.
They both just return functions.
Okay. So the thing I was asking is just that you know, add on, add observes, that's going to be, these are just like imported functions, just like you name it when you import it, and like any other function that you might want to use that you import. And I was saying that I was messing around with using decorators for as a substitute for the Ember concurrency API, which also has a thing called on and observes and a few other things. And so I was just thinking from a sort of like community standpoint, whether like if you wanted to use both on observes for reset foo, which are decorators that work on functions, you would also have to have an on observes separately imported and renamed so as to not collide if you had any tasks that you wanted to apply to it. I guess I'm just thinking out loud as whether there's ever going to be like a conventional way to just like do the right thing without having to make you rename stuff. I don't know. Just kind of musing out loud. But I think it will be something that comes up. Not a question. I think I just want everyone to hear my voice.
So I think, generally speaking, I think the point of it being imports is that you control exactly what you call it. The real question you're asking is, how do we decide what what do you say in your documentation that you should use? If you would, like for Ember concurrency, you say like import on, then it would suck if you then have to like now talk, well, the import of on from Ember concurrency or the import of on from Ember decorators or something, right? So but that's not really a new problem. Like you could have, like that is a common problem, right? So yes, yeah. I mean, it's really common to have imports that like named imports have the same name.
But then if you wanted to use it thing on the right, you'd have to do import observes, whatever.
No, you would.
Then you'd have import
On
observes as task observes.
Yes.
But then like another file, you go the other way to the other thing. The thing.
I'm sorry, Alex.
Can you go to the slide with the constructor and just go over that again? Because I think for me, like watching your presentation, like the decorators look great, but then I see this and I'm like, this looks pretty bad to me. Yeah, this looks, yeah.
Right. So class fields get applied to the instance of the class instead of on the prototype, which is how fields that you pass into ember.object.extend got applied to the class. So because of that, they have to be applied after the call to super. And because of that, we will always overwrite any value that we pass in to .create. And early on, we talked about maybe changing create so that it first created the class and then initialized it with those properties. But that would have been a pretty large internal change, and we didn't think that would be for the best. Like I said, there is this other syntax, which I think is much, much cleaner. And it doesn't have to be this boilerplate exactly. It could be this dot value or just colon or line default value. And then it could also be handled with a very simple decorator that would essentially do the same thing. It would just immediately, through an initializer, check that the value, whether or not the value exists, and then assign a value to it if it doesn't. If you did want to put it on the prototype, there is the proto decorator. So that just puts it on the prototype. Static does not put anything on the prototype, it puts it on the constructor, which is a little bit different. So we can't use static, but this would effectively be that third keyword that you could use to play around with these things. As the question was, as an application developer, will we have to think commonly about where these properties should be? And I don't think so. I think that we can figure out a common solution either in the form of a decorator or just through idioms like the one that class that I have to keep finding. This one. I'm not sure which one is the right solution at this point, though, and I think this is the time to figure that out. Decorators are still in flux, classes are still in flux, so I think we should try out a few different solutions, figure out which one works the best for Ember, which one works the best for our community, and then slowly kind of consolidate on one, hopefully. The question is, what is getting passed? What are the signatures of these functions? Like, what are they receiving? What are they returning? So actually, both on and observes are functions that return functions, which are the decorators themselves. They are receiving the name of the event that you're going to be listening for, or property change that you're going to be listening for. Then they, actually, let me see if I can open up utility decorators right here. So then the decorator itself is a function that receives this function signature, which is target, the class that it is going to be applied to. Here, let me. Target, which is the class itself, and you can manipulate the class, the prototype from here. Key, so the key that it is being applied to, and the descriptor if it exists, which is kind of a question at the moment. TypeScript says sometimes it doesn't. Babel says it does. So we kind of have to figure out what the behavior is going to be in all cases. So the descriptor is just like the same thing you would pass into define property if you were using object.define property. So the question was, what do I think class syntax could kind of make easier for Ember developers, really, from a tooling perspective? I think a lot of static analysis in editors, being able to do maybe automated refactoring to some extent, being able to, like in VS Code right now, you can kind of click through sometimes for imports and whatnot. It would be much easier to click to the definition of a function if you knew that function existed on a particular class and you knew what the type of that class was. And you can already see that with like TypeScript if you ever open up a TypeScript project in VS Code. So I think editor tooling is going to be huge there. In terms, and like I said, also documentation tooling I think is going to be huge. In terms of like in the browser developer tools, I'm not so sure. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. So unlocking native getters and setters is another thing that would be huge. Yeah. Cool. All right. I think that's everything. Thank you. All right.